Head on a swivel. This is AviatorCast, episode 116.
Calling all aviators, you've landed at AviatorCast, the top podcast resource for interviews, refreshers, lessons, training topics, and more. Join weekly and share in our passion for flying things, exploring the rare air through flight. And now, another episode. Preflight complete, fuel on board, and flight plan filed. Let's kick the tires and light the fires. Here's your host, Chris Palmer.
Welcome, aviators. You've landed at AviatorCast. My name is Chris Palmer. Being an aviator means you are subjecting yourself to a higher sense of awareness and responsibility. These flying machines are not cheap, nor is any incident or accident that they get in. It's always an expensive endeavor. That's why we as pilots need to keep our head on a swivel and make sure we don't bend any metal. So welcome to this, the 116th episode of AviatorCast. It is my pleasure to have you here, and this is going to be a good one today. I'm really excited about the subject we have at hand. We're going to be covering today collision avoidance and basically how not to hit stuff in an airplane. So that's going to be the main subject for today. Now, I've expanded this a little bit because sometimes collision avoidance, people only refer to that as in air rather than on the ground, or even wrapping into this subject something like runway incursions. And so I've taken a broader approach to this collision avoidance thing, and basically anything that we could hit with our airplane we want to talk about today. So that's going to be what we go over. So even on the runway, we're going to be talking about that. In the air and on the ground, we're going to be covering those subjects. So that is it for today. It's the collision avoidance. As always, AviatorCast is brought to you by Aviator Training, offering online ground school. Get the free, downloadable, and new private pilot action plan, 5 things to do before your first flight lesson. Sign up today at aviatortraining.com. A really simple process there. And I'll get that new guide to you just in a few minutes. That's something that I've been working on a lot these last few weeks, is making sure that people have a couple steps to get started before they even get into flight school. So go ahead and go to aviatortraining.com and sign up for that. So for those of you that haven't been on the show before, one of the things we do before we get into the show is we read a review. Now, if I read your review on the show, say that you leave your review on somewhere like iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or something else, have a really good YouTube review coming up that I'm going to put on here. I have one today from iTunes, but if I end up reading your review on the show, then I'm going to send you an AviatorCast t-shirt. And it's just a way of me saying thank you for listening to the show, reviewing the show, and letting others know that you enjoy it. So today, I have a review from Leslie, and Leslie actually reached out to me through email before or just after leaving this review, and she lives on the Big Island in Hawaii, from what I remember, or maybe it's Maui. So she says, informative, challenging, and encouraging, gives us 5 stars. She says, AviatorCast is one of my favorite aviation podcasts. As a 100-hour private pilot, sometimes I feel discouraged that it will take forever to reach my aviation goals. Chris is very encouraging with a down-to-earth style and reminds his listeners consistently it's one step at a time. I love his perspective on flight training, and every episode is engaging and entertaining. Thank you, Chris, for the awesome content. And again, that's from Leslie. So she and I talked a little bit through email, and she used to own a flight school and an FBO in another part of the country. But when she moved to Hawaii, she ended up getting out of flying for a while. So here's an example of a pilot that's passionate about aviation, that's still staying engaged with content from things like AviatorCast. And she's excited to get back into it, but it's a little more expensive down there, and she's trying to connect with the community down there. So maybe you are in that same sort of situation where you have been a pilot, but you're kind of out of it for a while. I know that I've been through those times in my life where I'm just out of aviation for a while, and it's really depressing, and you're really looking to get back into it. So things like AviatorCast and a bunch of other sources out there are really good for people to just keep their head in the game. So that's what we do here quite a bit on AviatorCast is we talk to different people in the industry. I do some interviews. I've also been doing a lot more of these educational type podcasts where I answer some issues that people are having, maybe with staying in aviation and staying active, or we cover a big subject like we're going to do today with collision avoidance, and just keep your head in the game and keep you learning and keep you thinking about aviation. Now, we're going to be talking about some collision avoidance things today, but as we get toward the end, I'm actually going to give you some tips on how you can practice collision avoidance when you're not even flying. So think driving, okay? What are some of the things you do while you're driving to practice collision avoidance? So that's going to be what we're getting into. If you want to leave a review for the show and have it read on the show, I'll send you a t-shirt. Leslie, you and I are already in touch. I think I had you fill out that form for the t-shirt, but really appreciate you leaving that review. So that's the intro of the show. Now we're going to get into the main content where we will discuss collision avoidance. So let's get to that. All right, so we are going to be discussing collision avoidance today, as I've said several times already. So again, this is going to be a broader topic. We're not just talking about mid-air collisions, but we're talking about runway incursions. We're talking about hitting something on the ground. We're talking about a bunch of stuff. Anything that you hit with your airplane, other than clouds and rain and the sort of things we're supposed to hit with our airplanes, we're going to be talking about those. Now, as I go through this topic, if you have anything you want to add, please tell me that in a comment. I like to improve myself as an instructor, and I will improve this content for my future students with your input. So please give me input through your comments where you are seeing this live video. I would really appreciate that. And if you viewing this show live on YouTube or Facebook or Periscope want to have a discussion after this podcast is over, then I will stick around a little bit after the main show is over, and we can have a bit of a Q&A session for several minutes. Okay, so let's get into it now. So, there's actually a kind of a sad story that happened this last week. Here in Alaska, we had a mid-air collision just several days ago in Anchorage. So the long and short of the story was that these two aircraft were headed out over some flats to the northwest of Anchorage, and they had a mid-air collision. Now, very unfortunately, one of the pilots, a longtime professional pilot, very respected in the community, lost his life, and his airplane wasn't able to be controlled, and they later recovered his body. And subsequently, it's a hit to the community that really appreciated the work that he did. So there was another airplane that did make it back to Anchorage, and you see a picture of it here if you're watching the live video. They made it back to Anchorage. They only had one wheel. They had their right main wheel in a Cessna 175, and they crash landed on the runway. Now, as you can see in the picture, the airplane's mainly intact. The people on board were okay, but unfortunately, there was loss of life in this situation. So because of this thing that had happened locally, this kind of brought things up for me. What am I doing for collision avoidance? What are the tools that I've been using all along to make sure that I don't hit something or somebody? Of course, when you're in the air and you're really vulnerable, that becomes much more of an issue where, you can lose control of the airplane, as we saw in this situation. My heart and my prayers go out to the family of this situation. I'm not trying to glorify this or anything. I'm trying to use lessons to move forward. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So starting on kind of a low note, but as pilots, we know that those things happen. And as we continue to learn, we can learn from others. Now, I'm not even saying there were any mistakes made in this case. Sometimes things just kind of come together. But what can we do to make sure we build things safely in our favor? That's going to be what we're talking about today, and the main meat and potatoes of this podcast. It will be a very quick, hard-hitting, fast podcast with a bunch of different points that I want to get across. So I hope that as I move through those, that you catch a few things that are useful to you if you're already a pilot. If you're not a pilot yet, this is going to be a great subject for you moving forward. You're probably going to get more out of this than you would in some of the books out there. I really tried to put together quite a bit of this, and so you can understand it in context. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out as though we are on the ground, okay? So we're going to transition from the ground before we even start up the engine and go all the way through to being in the air and what we do on the other side, okay? So we're going to start on the ground and go through that entire process. So first off is the tie downs, okay? This doesn't seem like such a big issue, but as you're moving into the airport, there's other airplanes sitting there that are tied down, and you want to make sure that that you are not going to hit those airplanes. You want to make sure that your airplane itself is tied down properly. Think of a windstorm coming up and grabbing your airplane and tossing it on top of someone else's airplane, okay? That is your airplane hitting someone else's airplane, something we don't want. And even if it didn't hit someone else's airplane, it could damage your airplane. So tie downs are a really important thing. There's also something that can happen when you are taxiing over the ropes or the chains for tie downs, even if you're on a ramp, where if your power is too high, that can actually be sucked up into the propeller. So think that sometimes as you're pulling into a parking spot or pulling away from a parking spot, that you could potentially be sucking up a rope or something into your propeller. So don't just do whatever you want. Be aware of those things that are laying on the ground that you could suck up into your propeller, okay? So that is tie downs. Just a really quick thing, and maybe you have some other tie down things to mention too. But it's very important to properly tie down and to go check your tie downs if there's a big storm coming in. That's just kind of what people do. They check on their airplanes, make sure everything's good to go, and that when the airplanes are just sitting there, there's nothing awry. The next one is prop clearance. So as pilots, when we start an airplane, we want to make sure that the whole area is clear. You've kind of seen it when you're flying a jet, okay? You look down, you say you have a window seat right next to the engine, you look down, you see this area painted around the engine that says no personnel or something along those lines, okay? They don't want anyone getting sucked into that engine. Now, while a general aviation propeller-driven airplane doesn't suck things in, that propeller is a weapon. And if something is in the way, a person or something or whatever, it is going to cause a lot of damage. So, of course, in your pre-flight, when you're walking around the airplane, you're going to check the propeller area, make sure there's nothing there. A common thing for people to lose track of or to leave that's dangerous in that area would be a tie down, which we've already talked about, and then a tow bar. Disastrous things can happen with a tow bar that is left on a nose wheel. It can be sucked up into the propeller. If you have retractable gear, it can ruin the nose wheel when the gear is retracted upon takeoff. So if you ever see someone taxiing with tow bar on, try to wave them down. Do everything you can to wave them down and tell them to cut the engine so that they can get that tow bar taken off. So we clear the area basically, okay? So that's the pre-flight of clearing the area for the prop. But we also, of course, most important of all of this, of course, is human life. We don't care if the airplane gets damaged more than we care about human life, okay? So we want to make sure there's no one in the area. One thing we do as pilots before we start the engine is we crack the window or crack the door and we say, clear prop. We yell out, clear prop, or something along those lines. That's to make sure that there's no one around, there's no one squatted down, doing something underneath for whatever reason. I always thought this was a little funny. For whatever reason, underneath the propeller and trying to do something, okay? Then we yell clear prop. We wait several seconds for someone to react to that. We actually scan and we look around, and then we can start the engine. Just a really important thing to make sure we do that. Also, it's important to make sure that you tell your passengers to respect the propeller. Don't let anyone touch it. Propellers, in certain situations, if there's a ground lead that is disconnected, they can start even if the master switch and magnetos are off. So you do not want anyone inadvertently starting the engine. Again, that propeller is a major weapon, and many people have lost their lives because of a propeller. And this even goes for the engine already being started and people walking into it, because of course, once it started, you can't really see it. And so they'll walk right into it, and that can be very dangerous too. Always be aware of that. If you're getting out or getting in an airplane, it's actually really not a good idea to even do that with the engine on, because of the sort of accidents that can happen. It's just a simple loss in judgment for a few seconds could have even an experienced pilot walking into a propeller. So that is prop clearance. Okay, prop blast. So we've started up. We are about to power up and head out, and we push that throttle all the way forward, and there's this nice new airplane sitting right behind us, and we just blow a bunch of prop blast on that brand new airplane, spitting rocks and dust and dinging the paint job and all sorts of things. Okay, prop blast. We got to be aware of what we are doing with the energy that is going behind us. That propeller is actually pushing a whole lot of air. It's like this big column of air being pushed right behind you. So be aware that column of air has a lot of power to push rocks and all sorts of debris on people. So it can be people, it can be cars, it can be buildings, it could be anything, okay? It could be anything that could potentially cause damage. Just be aware of that. That's going to be something, powering up out of your parking spot. That's going to be something where if you are holding short and you're about to power up, being aware of that. There's a lot of things to be aware of in terms of your prop blast, and that's just something that can get away from people. So there it is. Maybe you have some other situations, and you can leave those in the comments and let me know. The next one is wing awareness. Okay, so usually when we are in a car, we're cruising along, we have just this body from side to side, and that's all we have. But once we get in an airplane, here we are cruising along, and now we have a wide berth that we need to keep clear. That is why taxiways are so wide and why airports are relatively so clear, is because we don't want any obstacles in our way. Those big wings can clip a lot of things, whether it be buildings or other airplanes or whatever it is. You're not in a car anymore. You're in a very wide looking airplane. And we need to be aware of that. Now, I'm going to give you some tips later on in terms of how to approach a situation where you aren't familiar with the airport, you're not sure if you have wing clearance, and just an overall, hey, I'm not sure if I can squeeze this through. There should never be a question, and you can work on making sure that in those situations you can simply get out. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that here in several minutes, is what you would do in that particular situation. Okay. While taxiing. So we're actively moving along now. Here is where we really need to start to get on the defensive, because we're moving along now. It's always been said that you don't want to taxi faster than you can think, because if any sort of obstacle or anything comes up, you want to be able to stop the airplane or even stop the propeller if you have to in a certain amount of time to get out of the way. Now, my friend Steve Thorne, who's also known as Flight Chops, had a situation where a Cub that he regularly flew, loved this airplane, someone else was taxiing this Cub, and they taxied it into a concrete barrier, one of those pillars. I think it was protecting a fuel station or something, and basically completely totaled the airplane for several years. They were considering not even fixing the airplane, but I think they did eventually decide to fix the airplane. But a concrete barrier, okay, you've got a tailwheel airplane, you can't really see over the nose. That concrete barrier is fairly low, and that person taxied straight into it. It wasn't Steve that taxied into it, but that whoever was renting it at the time taxied right into it, okay? So there are all sorts of obstacles that we have as we're taxiing and doing other things that we need to be aware of. Now, there's the regular airports where you have obstacles. There are airports where maybe the ground is softer or there are trees around, maybe you're off airport. So those obstacles like rocks and divots and all sorts of things that can get a little bit more adventurous, we want to be aware of those as well. Of course, there are a lot of vehicles moving around the airport too. We'll talk about that here in a second. Buildings, just all sorts of stuff. Overall, we just want to be very aware of where we're going and what we're doing. Of course, that situational awareness while we're taxiing, which is a whole different subject, but we don't want to hit anything, and we never want to be in question on if we're going to hit anything or not as well, okay? So the next one here is going to be airport vehicles. So I had this situation pop up several years ago when I was pulling off the runway here in Homer, okay? I was pulling off the runway, had just come off the taxiway, and I stopped at the hold short after the hold short point, and I did my after landing checklist, taxi checklist, and just powered up to move forward. It's just about to get on the ramp, and this little vehicle shot out right in front of me. Okay, right in front of me, cut me off. I literally had to slam on the brakes to stop. And I was mad, okay? I have the right of way. I'm an airplane. I'm at the airport. That vehicle does not have the right of way. So I wasn't very happy about the situation. Never ended up meeting the guy. Never had any strong words with him or anything. That doesn't really matter. What mattered is that I was on the defense no matter what. I was always looking out for any obstacle around me. I was scanning to the left, scanning to the right, scanning ahead, whatever it was, head on a swivel, right? Making sure that I wasn't going to hit anything. And in fact, this old beater truck shoots out in front of me and cuts me off on the taxiway where I had the right of way. Of course, those rules didn't matter at that time. What mattered is that I just got through the situation, and it is what it is. So there are other things going on at the airport. You know, airplanes are not the only thing that are operating at an airport. You have other people that are there. You have maybe even other pilots on the ramp, other airplanes that are moving around. You just have to think ahead and plan and see things before they happen. So the sooner you can see things, the better off you're going to be when it comes to keeping yourself out of these situations. So that is airport vehicles. All right, so what about when you just don't know? Okay, you're pulling up to that building. You've got the taxiway on both sides. It looks like it's a little tight. You've never been there before. You don't know if your wingspan can really fit. Or maybe there's a gap for you between a building and the tail of an airplane. That's kind of how it is for us pulling into where we are, is we have this little gap where we pull in between the tail of a Super Cub and a hangar, okay? Now, we've done it before, so we know we can do it, but for people that are first-timers to taxiing in like that, I usually take over the controls until they really learn how to do it and see what they're doing. It takes a little bit of practice. So if you just don't know, don't push it, okay? Don't assume that your wings are going to clear anything. It could be a very, very expensive mistake or just an annoying mistake. Even if you scrape someone's paint or scraped off a light or something, it is just makes me sick thinking about it. You don't want to do something like that. So maybe there's someone else out there, okay? Maybe it's a mechanic. Maybe it's someone at the airport. You can wave them down and maybe do a little sign language, say, hey, keep some eyes on my wings and help me taxi through here. And then they can help you keep an eye on the wings and see if you'll fit through there, okay? You'll notice that with every airliner that pushes back these days, you have wing walkers, okay? You have a marshaller on each wing and someone on the tail that's watching to make sure that that airplane does not hit anything, because it's a very expensive mistake. The airplane isn't even running yet, but it's a very expensive mistake to hit something. So maybe wave someone down. If that doesn't work, there's no one around, there is no shame in shutting down the engine, getting out, and making sure that it can be done. That in and of itself is a really helpful tool for you to be able to make sure that you're not going to hit anything, okay? So if all else fails, just shut her down, get out of the airplane, and investigate. And then when you come up with a plan, of action, whether that be pushing the airplane back. Say you got into a situation where you couldn't move forward, you need to push it back. Now, whatever it is, now you actually have some options, right? Not just hitting something and then you got to go through a bunch of paperwork and have the shameful call to that person that owns that airplane. So again, when you just don't know, get out, investigate, come up with a plan, and do the next thing. That's going to be really, really important for when you just don't know. All right. So what about in between? We've talked about the ground. Of course, eventually we're going to talk about the air. That just makes sense. It's collision avoidance, especially talking about mid-air collisions and some other things along with that. But what about the in between? And I thought that it was a really important time to bring up runway incursions, because the runway is kind of this transitionary zone between the ground and the air. And it's this awkward place where we're taking a flying machine that's meant to be flying, we're taxiing and we're taking off. And in that transition, we're going from controlling the airplane in one way to immediately upon the wheels leaving the ground, we're controlling it in a different way. And we're slow and low and close to objects, and things are just kind of dangerous in this area. And I call this the no transgression zone, okay? This is where you don't want any mistakes by you or anyone else. Everyone is just very, very vulnerable. We're going, we're going slow if we're landing. We're fairly slow. We're close to stall. That's the whole point, is to get the airplane slow, close to stall, landing at the lowest energy possible. And then you have these situations where one airplane may be going fast and the other one is going slow. Say someone's taking off and they're going pretty slow. Someone's behind them, they're going fairly fast. Whatever it is, you have these different scenarios pop up that are just kind of odd. And then some people are flying in the blind because of the way the airplanes are set up. Runway incursions are a big thing that the FAA is very aware of. They have been teaching us instructors and trying to get the point across to pilots that they need to be very aware of these runways. And situational awareness, where you're at, of course, that all builds into this. But the biggest thing here in this particular subject is just making sure that we communicate. So now I'm going to give you some tips for both takeoff and landing as it pertains to the runway. And then we're going to get into the air stuff after that. So we're just going to talk about runway stuff right now, get into this particular subject area. Okay, so we're going to bring up some pro tips on takeoff. So the biggest thing here, I think, is to have great communication. And a lot of the times that starts with just being courteous, playing nice, communicating well, making sure everyone knows what's going on, and you being calm and collected in that situation, okay? So I find that when I don't know what's going on and I'm in question of what someone else is doing, I simply communicate, okay? And you're going to see that here in a few seconds as well in another point, but I just simply communicate. I do so in a calm way, and I give people the benefit of the doubt, all right? If there are any strong words that need to be exchanged, those can be done on the ground and done so respectfully. But I've never had too many situations like that. I think most pilots, some make honest mistakes and most are good about it and fess up to it. But I just think playing nice and being courteous and starting from there is an important thing, okay? Build a picture of the traffic in your mind. So one thing that you learn as you gain more experience as a pilot is that even while you're taxiing defensively, looking out for all those things that could hurt you or you could hurt, that you are still listening to the traffic. And while you're doing that, you're building a picture of the traffic in your mind so that you know that a guy is coming in on downwind, a gal has just taken off. You know that someone else is taxiing from the other side and is going to be holding short of that runway. So you're building a picture of everything that's happening so that you have situational awareness just going into it. I find this is really helpful in terms of being courteous as well, because you can make sure that you're not cutting anyone off in the pattern. You can make sure that if you need to hold off taxiing onto a certain taxiway, you can do that. bunch of different things that help out by having situational awareness to make sure that you aren't, going to cut someone off or whatever it is. So building that traffic picture in your mind. All right. Expect the unexpected. And I was thinking about this one a little bit. There's that saying out there that says trust but verify, right? And while I think that's true, I don't think that trusting right out the gate is important first. I think it should almost be the opposite. It should be almost verify and then trust. Verify that that person is in fact doing what they said they were doing. They're actually holding short. They're actually on the taxiway they said they're going to be on. They're actually landing on the runway they said they were landing on. People make honest mistakes. They get runway numbers mixed up, whatever it is. You got to make sure you don't take their word for it and just trust them out the gate. You first verify, get your eyes on them, and then you can trust that they're actually doing what they say they're doing, okay? So verify and then trust, I think, is an important aspect of this. One thing I do and teach my students to do is do a 360-degree turn before pulling out onto the runway if practical. Now, this isn't always practical, but basically this is your way of doing a quick 360 on the ground, scanning the sky, making sure that there's no one that isn't communicating that's coming in for a landing or whatever it is, just making sure that everything's good to go before you pull out on the runway, okay? Before you make yourself vulnerable, that no one is actually there. Now, I've actually heard of accidents, not accidents actually, but incidents where even in controlled airspace, aircraft were landing on the wrong runway and almost causing accidents, okay? That can be a very, very scary thing. And so even in controlled airspace, you need to be on your toes. And even with air traffic control, you need to verify and then trust. Okay, you don't just blindly trust anybody with your life. You've got to make sure that in all of these situations that you are on your toes. Okay, so that 360-degree turn really helps you in making sure that the area is in fact clear, but it isn't always practical because you may be at a busy airport with an airplane right behind you, and it doesn't make sense to do a little 360-degree turn. So you can't always do it, okay? But you still can still keep your head on a swivel and make sure that that no one is there. Okay, another rule I have is to always check the final before I pull out. So this kind of goes back to the 360-degree turn thing. I just make sure that as I'm pulling out and I'm turning my back to the approach side of the runway, that there is in fact no one there. And in a high-wing airplane, it's particularly important because you can't see very much above you. So a lot of times what you need to do is you need to pull out, you need to turn a little bit to be able to see the final enough, and then you need to go. I even had an incident a couple, I would say 4 or 5 months ago, where I had done my 360-degree turn. I got distracted with something else with a student, and he had a question and we were talking about it for a minute or two. And then I went to pull out on the runway. And as I was pulling out to turn and look and simultaneously making my radio call that I was pulling out, someone said that they were on final. And so I slammed the brakes. I wasn't even quite over the hold short marker yet, but I slammed the brakes. I announced that I was holding short, so that pilot knew that I wasn't going to move anymore, and averted a situation where I could have pulled out in front of somebody. Okay, we're all able to make these mistakes with some little different thing in our procedure. Okay, so just always being on your toes, checking that final, and this is something you do even when you're landing. You're checking that final and making sure that no one is there, just to verify one last time before, again, you turn your back and you are vulnerable to the approach end of the runway. And that's what the next one is about, is don't spend long with your back to the approach end of the runway. It's a very dangerous position to be in. We don't have rear view mirrors. The airplanes that are landing on that runway likely have an attitude that's a little higher sometimes. Maybe their nose is a little higher, especially those in tailwheel airplanes that are maybe trying to do a 3-point landing where their nose is a little high. They may never even see you, okay? They could land right on top of you and not even see you. So you need to make sure that's clear, and you can't just lollygag once you're out there on the runway. You need to have a plan of action to be ready to go so that the situation doesn't change. Because again, a situation can change just within a matter of seconds to where, yes, you were clear, you did your checks, to where, no, you are not clear now. And in just 30 seconds, someone traveled a mile and they're now on short final. So need to be really careful with this one. Make sure that you're ready to take off. When it's time to take off, you pull out and you're basically ready to go. A couple seconds getting your bearings and everything is okay. I'm not saying to be in a rush. There's never a time to really be in a rush, but just make sure that you're not sitting there forever on the runway with your back to the approach end. Okay, so that is the pro tips for takeoff, and now we're going to get into the pro tips for landing. So, landing. This is kind of going back to the mini story that I just shared, where I almost pulled onto the runway. Don't trust pilots that are holding short. Okay. I always watch these people as if they were people at an intersection that are completely ignoring a red light and they're about to pull through. I just kind of assume that they could pull out, okay? And I keep an eye on them. I make sure that they're not going to do it. And if they start to move from that hold short line while I'm on final, even though I've made my radio calls and everything else, even if I've been cleared to land by tower, I'm doing a go around as they start to move. So in my situation, right, where I shared that story, I started to pull out as if I was going to head onto the runway. That pilot that was landing, I'm sure, could see that. And even, I'm pretty sure in his radio call, the way his inflection was, he made the radio call because he saw me moving. Okay, so my radio call immediately was that I was stopping, I was holding short. So he knew that I knew I wasn't going to move out onto the runway. Okay, giving him, again, being courteous to him, that said I'm not going to move anymore. So when you're landing, don't trust the pilots holding short. Just very, very, very important. Okay, listen to the radio calls. Now, this goes for anything really, but it's, even takeoff and taxiing. Listen to the radio calls, but make sure that you know the runway you're landing on. Make sure that you know what other people are doing, especially when we're dealing with landing and being in the pattern. We all know that things can get pretty busy when you're in the pattern, so we need to be really careful about this situation. Just make sure we're, again, building that mental picture of what is happening. Consider the intersecting runways, all right? There have been situations where intersecting runways have led to accidents, where one aircraft will be landing on an intersecting runway, the other aircraft will be taking off from that other runway, and then they meet at the same exact moment in the middle, and there's a major issue, okay? There was actually a fairly prominent accident recently where a Citation, I believe, and a Cessna 150 got involved in an accident. And this was an intersecting runway thing. The Cessna 150 ended up clipping the tail of the Citation and crashing, and I'm not sure if it was one or two people in there, but they were fatally injured, okay? So the Cessna 150 did not have good luck. The Citation ended up being okay, and a lot of people came out. They're saying, oh man, these stupid pilots at these small airports that don't know how to make radio calls, they're not being professional, and they really need to do better because these professional pilots really can't deal with this, okay? Well, through the investigation, it ended up turning out that it was the Citation that was not making the radio calls, okay? The Citation was not communicating, and so it ended up being their fault and not the Cessna 150, which was actually making radio calls and doing what they were supposed to do. So for those of you that frequently operate at airports with intersecting runways, be on your toes because you may get complacent. For those of you that infrequently operate at those airports, be aware of it as well because you're not used to it and you need to be aware of other pilots there. There's a really good Air Safety Institute video on this that does an air crash investigation of a similar accident that happened from intersecting runways. So just be aware of that. And that's just kind of one I came up with because I've been thinking about that a little bit more recently. Okay, don't fully trust air traffic control and their instructions. Now, I'm going to preface that by saying that I really respect air traffic control and the job that they do. And I think that they are professional and they do a great job, but they are invariably human. Okay, we're all human. We make mistakes. I think most pilots are good pilots. I think most pilots want to be safe. And I think most pilots strive to learn and grow and do all sorts of good things. But again, invariably, they are human and they make those mistakes. And it's just part of that human condition. And air traffic control is no different. So again, it's that verify but trust. We need to make sure that is the case. Again, there were some incidents. Again, I saw these on the Air Safety Institute videos on YouTube where there were some instances where pilots were landing on wrong runways or landing even though they weren't cleared to land, okay, at controlled airports. So you can't get complacent even at controlled airports. It wasn't necessarily the fault of air traffic control in that case. Their visibility is limited, especially for landing traffic. They can't really see exactly where you are and what runway you're lining up on from their position. So that can be pretty difficult. So they get a pass on a lot of that stuff. But there are also some scenarios out there and some things that have happened that have led to accidents because of air traffic control. So again, verify but trust. And again, I really do look up to and respect air traffic controllers and their professional work that they do. Just like we talked about before, on the next one, check the final. I check this every time I'm turning from base to final. It's one of the main purposes of making sure that you do a solid base leg is that you can check that final and make sure that no one is there. It's a really, really big one, okay? Verbally say it, actually look and actually do it, okay? Check the final. Be ready and prepared to do a go-around if you have to. You've learned how to do this in training. If you haven't yet, you will. Just be prepared that if someone pulls out or something goes wrong, that you are prepared to go around. Options there, if someone's right in front of you and they're taking off without a clearance and you are on a collision path for them straight ahead, nothing says that you can't offset from them and watch them very closely, okay? Slow down, do whatever you have to do, break off, whatever you have to do, but stay away from them, okay? I've even had situations where I was landing on the runway favoring the wind with someone coming the opposite direction. That happened to me one time. I saw a landing light coming straight for me while I was on final, and I'm like, I keyed the radio, we're landing this runway. We're just wondering what you're doing. What are your intentions? I had enough room to kind of have a chat about it. And so we just need to watch out. We need to be on our toes. We need to fly defensively. That's just the way it is. And we are particularly vulnerable when we are in the runway environment, in that no transgression zone. And we need to watch ourselves and we need to watch others and we need to verify and then trust. That's kind of the way this goes. Okay. Now let's get into in the air. So we've gone through the ground stuff. We've gone through the airport type stuff or the runway type stuff. And now we're talking about maybe more en route flight. We'll talk a little bit about traffic pattern and those things, but mainly the en route flight. So what do we do while we're out there in the big blue sky and we're cruising along and we're looking for other traffic? How do we look for them? What do we do? How do we avoid those situations? And that is more of what happened in that accident that I shared earlier. This was more of an en route segment. This wasn't something that happened just near an airport. So even when we're out there in the wild, we need to be on our toes. We especially need to be on our toes in those areas that are converging, areas like an airway or over a VOR. That's why airports are so busy, is because airplanes congregate at the airport, okay? It's the watering hole for the airplanes. That's where they meet up. And so we see more accidents around those areas, but it doesn't mean that these accidents can't happen elsewhere. Now, recently I was down in Florida for Sun and Fun. And my friend Cameron and I were flying back and forth from Daytona Beach every day to go to Sun and Fun. Now, during our transition in and out of Sun and Fun on several occasions, we had multiple very close calls with other traffic. And it makes sense. A lot of people are going into the air show. A lot of people are coming out of the air show. And we had situations where we would see someone on our ADS-B and they were converging. They were like right on top of us. And we literally had to dive away because we just didn't know where they were. We couldn't, even though we could see their blip on the screen, we couldn't get eyes on them and we didn't know where they were. So it's just a crazy thing to think that even with that tech, we couldn't see these people. And it was very, very close. We had some pretty close calls. I think probably closer to mid-air collisions than I've ever been myself. And I know that some other people have been very, very close, especially around airports. But it's a serious business. There are ways that we can converge in the sky. That's just kind of the way it is. All right. So let's get into this in the air thing. First off is what we call a traffic scan. Okay. Now this is something that basically what we do is we're looking out the window, just as you see in the picture here. We're looking out the window and we're scanning for traffic. We're scanning for traffic continuously. It gets a little bit weird when you get out in the wild because there's no regulation that says on a VFR flight plan, you have to talk to a particular area, okay? You could have some people on flight following. You could have some people on CTAF. So there's kind of a mixed bag of different controllers or CTAFs that they could be talking to. So not everyone's on the same frequency. It's really important that you keep a scan going. Kind of the standard scan that people say to do is you scan 10-degree increments of the sky vertically, slowly, kind of up and down, and then you continuously move across looking at 10-degree increments looking outside. Okay, that's VFR flying. Now, I think one of the troubles we're getting into these days is we have such amazing instrumentation and GPS and G1000 and all these, iPads, all these beautiful things to look at, and we're not looking outside as much. While we have some tools, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, that help us see traffic, like ADS-B, we need to be keeping our eyes outside the airplane. And that is actually one of the best ways to fly visually anyway. And then how I teach my students is to look outside, do that attitude sort of flying. So if we are flying the way we are supposed to fly, and we're setting the airplane up the way it's supposed to fly, we should be able to look outside the airplane 90% of the time, okay? 90% of the time, our attention should be outside, flying the airplane that way, going to a point in the distance, or a number of other things, attitude flying, looking for traffic, whatever it is, 90%, okay? So that is the traffic scan. There are some other methods people use, but I think that's the standard one, and I think it works good enough. Now, to contradict myself, now we get into the technology of things. So we have different systems like TIS and TCAS, which is a little more on the high end, and you're only going to find in most very expensive airplanes. And then we have the more affordable solution, which is coming out, which is ADS-B. It offers traffic through a network type of service that air traffic control is moving to, where all of the aircraft are meant to participate in that network of blips on the screen. So basically what this is it's all of the information that air traffic control is seeing, and now we as pilots get to see it by bringing data into our airplanes on what is called ADS-B in, or on an iPad with several different devices. We have a transponder that has ADS-B in. It's from Stratus or Apario. So it's from a company called Apario, and they have the Stratus line, which you can get installed stuff, or you can get kind of out of the box stuff where you can get ADS-B in. And then there is an ADS-B out mandate by 2020 that everyone is supposed to comply with. Okay. So this is really nice because it helps you know where to look, because really it's finding a needle in a haystack sometimes when you're looking around. especially if you have an airplane that's, different situation, but an airplane that's camouflaged against a suburban area, it's really hard to see from several miles away. So there's just all these little visual tricks that almost make it impossible to see airplanes. But if you can look on your screen with ADS-B and see where they are roughly, then you're not just continually scanning, which is still important, but then as that thing becomes more of an issue, you have a part of the sky that you can scan and really look for that person because they may be converging on you. So it is very, very helpful to use that technology. Okay. The next one is flight following. So I did a flight following podcast. I think it was last podcast. If not, it was in the last several episodes. Actually, I think it was 2 episodes ago for AviatorCast. You can go back and look at that one. I shared a whole lot about flight following, but essentially flight following is your eyes in the sky. So what is really helpful about this is that you dial in a frequency, you talk to air traffic control, you, in this case, you would dial in a discrete code on your transponder, a unique code for your area, and they would be able to see you on the screen and give you traffic advisories. So what they would do is they would see that you were converging with an airplane. They'd give you reports. They'd even give you suggestions on course of action to avoid that traffic, kind of giving you some of the tools that you would use if you were an IFR and they were giving you that separation. So really, really nice. It's a free tool. Actually helps you learn a lot of things like how to communicate better with air traffic control. But that's just another safety layer that you can use with en route flight is flight following. All right, rules and regulations. So this may surprise you, and I'm not sure many people know this particular thing about you as a pilot keeping separation from other airplanes, but this is how the FAA explains it, or at least how I'm going to explain how the FAA expects you to approach visual separation from other aircraft, how they say it in the regulations. So the only time a pilot is not obligated legally for their own aircraft separation is when they are in IFR, so under an IFR flight plan, and you're actually in instrument conditions. So you're actually in the clouds, you're actually in those conditions. That is the one time where you are not ultimately responsible for aircraft separation. So even under IFR, if you are on an IFR flight plan and you have visual flight rules, then you are in charge of your visual separation from other aircraft. So even on an IFR flight plan, you think, hey, it's instruments. I'm supposed to be able to look at my instruments the whole time, keep my heads down, and not have to look outside for traffic. But that's not actually the case. You do have to look outside, and you do have to look for other traffic when you are in visual conditions. That is the way the regulations are written. So that's the way it is. Now, of course, when we are VFR, it's just up to us all the time, okay? While we may be able to have ADS-B and TCAS and flight following and get those updates from air traffic control, they are not responsible. It is up to us to keep that visual separation from aircraft in that situation. So I just thought I'd bring that up to you guys, that it is up to you unless you're on an IFR flight plan and in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. So that is rules and regulations. I'm sure there's other rules and regulations. We could go on and on and on and on about that, but that's the one I wanted to bring up. Okay, wanted to talk about blind spots. So imagine this. Imagine you are a low wing airplane, okay? You're coming into an airport, you're descending into the runway, and you're a low wing airport. You're right on glide slope, okay? You have nailed it. You're right on that pappy, and you're just coming right down perfect on that 3-degree glide slope. Everything's looking nice and pretty, okay? But there's this other guy down here. He's been flying at 100 feet all day. He's a Cessna 185. He's cruising along, just really enjoying the low and slow flying, okay? And he's coming in too, but he isn't communicating on the radio. So you're a low wing. You have bad visibility below you because of those wings, and the high wing has bad visibility above him because of his wings. You're coming down just perfect on your glide slope. He's coming in, a really shallow 1 degree glide slope, and the two of you converge. One goes on top of the other, and there's a midair collision. You would not imagine how common that situation is for midair collisions. That is actually usually how it happens. It happens around an airport where airplanes are blind to each other and hitting each other. Okay. Someone's not communicating, someone's not looking, whatever it is, many different things. Crazy stuff can happen. There are situations where people have dove from above to cut someone off. I think that's really rare. I don't think most pilots are jerks like that. In fact, they aren't. Most pilots are awesome. But stuff happens. But blind spots, okay? Think about the vulnerabilities of your airplane and where you cannot see. That goes for both in the air and on the ground. There's a reason why warbirds taxi like this back and forth, is so they can actually see where they're going. If they just keep their nose straight ahead and go down the taxiway, even though they can relatively go straight down the taxiway by in their peripheral vision seeing where the grass is on either side, even though they can do that, it doesn't mean it's smart. Okay, there might be someone ahead of them, so they do this little snake move going down the taxiway. In the air, where can you not see, and make sure that you look there if you can. Very, very important. All right, so that is the blind spots. Vertical separation. So vertical separation alludes to, or rather refers to, VFR altitudes, IFR altitudes, traffic patterns, these hard altitudes that, I guess I wouldn't call them hard, I'd call them more soft, because it's actually not regulated that we absolutely have to fly that particular pattern altitude, but they are these altitudes that really assist us in making sure that if we are on opposite headings, we're at full throttle, full power, and we're en route, that we're not going to converge at each other straight at the same altitude. And so we have what are called VFR altitudes and IFR altitudes, and they're split up for direction of flight. So if you're going to the west, you are on even thousands of feet plus 500 for VFR. And if you're going to the east, you are on odd thousands of feet plus 500 feet. And then if you're IFR, you're always just right at those altitudes, no 500 foot out above. So you can get that more into that in your books, but basically the reason this is set up is so you're not converging at each other at the same exact altitude. So if one of you is headed west and the other is east, you're at least going to be apart from each other by 1,000 feet if you're on a VFR flight plan. So that is vertical separation. And then of course we have traffic patterns, and the steps we take in traffic patterns to make sure that we don't converge on top of somebody by, if we're crossing midfield, we start at 500 feet above the traffic pattern, then we come down in to make sure we're not just directly coming into somebody, but even then you need to make sure you're not coming down on top of somebody. So different situations, that's vertical separation. All right. Now, say you are not flying. What are some things you can do when you are not flying? And this is something I think is interesting and something I've been trying to do more because I'm not always flying, It's nice when I'm flying a lot more than I'm driving, but I just go through these lulls where I'm not flying as much. So what can we do to keep our head in the game? Well, we drive on dangerous roads every day, and it's arguable with data and without data that driving is more dangerous than flying. So we've all seen idiot drivers. We've all seen crazy things. Most people have seen accidents. So what can we do to increase our situational awareness while we're on the ground? And I've really been trying to scan every intersection and cross intersection as I'm coming up to it, stop signs, whatever it is, of cars as I'm coming up to that intersection. Make sure no one's moving, okay? If someone's creeping out, just like they be creeping out from a hold short line, my alarms start to go off, and I make sure that I'm steering clear, slowing down, whatever it is. I don't trust them. So you don't always just trust a green light. You gotta or a stop sign, you got to look and make sure that those people are themselves obeying the rules. So I think that's one way that we can really look forward. Now, another very sad thing, and I hate to even bring this up, but there have been accidents where people have hit children when they're starting their cars and backing them up. And so even having just a quick little circle around your car, make sure there's nothing in the way. That's your pre-flight, okay? That's your clear prop moment for your car. Just making sure that nothing's there before you back out. So just these things, I'm sure there are a number of other aspects of driving that we could use to build into our muscle memory, our practice in building this situational awareness with driving. But this is something I kind of came up with at last second. So I'm probably going to do a whole podcast on what we can practice with driving to help us in our flying. So, because all these little thoughts always come up. So that's something I'm going to build and do someday. Okay. So that is where we've been. Okay. We talked about what happens on the ground, having a lot of situational awareness on the ground before we even start the engine, things we need to look for. We talked about taxiing. We talked about runway incursions in the no transgression zone of the runway, and the importance of making sure that when we're vulnerable in that area, that we're not making mistakes, and that we're not trusting other people just blindly, but that we're verifying and certain little things we can do to check those things. And then some of the safety mechanisms we can use with a scan and with flight following and with our vertical separation in flight, en route, that we can use to keep that separation from other aircraft. Make sure that we never hit anything. Make sure that our airplanes stay nice and healthy and pretty, and that we are safe. That's what's most important at the end of the day. So that is it for the content of this episode. I'm going to have a few closing thoughts, and then we will get into the end of the episode here. So let's get into that.
Join us next week for another exciting topic or interview with a great guest. All AviatorCast resources can be found at AviatorCast.com. Subscribe to AviatorCast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, and other podcast services. Did you enjoy the show? Review AviatorCast on iTunes or similar service. If your review is aired on the show, we'll send you an official AviatorCast t-shirt. As always, we'd love to hear from you. Write AviatorCast at me@aviatorcast.com to introduce yourself or to ask any questions you may have about aviation. Now, for the final release clearance, back to Chris Palmer.
All right, guys, make sure that you keep your head on swivel, okay? We talked a whole lot about collision avoidance today. It's another reminder to keep ourselves and our airplanes safe and try to avoid some of these accidents that may be avoidable. So I hope you guys learned something from today. Really appreciate you being here for more of a content, teaching, learning rich episode. Really appreciate it. Hope you got something from it. Hope you'll review the show if you enjoyed it. Please leave comments on YouTube, on our blog, where this episode will be featured. You can go there at aviatorcast.com for the show notes and some other things that I'll put there, kind of a summary of this episode. You can get that private pilot action plan, 5 things you need to do before your first flight, by going there. And as always, we have online ground school at Aviator Training. So we have it for private. I'm currently working hard on instrument, and then we're going to have commercial by the end of the year as well. So we're building a whole library of these tools so that as you move through your aviation career, that you have good, solid, real-world training from an active instructor, all right? So if you aren't going through training yourself, or it's not looking like you're going to be going through any of these ratings soon, you can also tell your friends that we are an option out there that is great, okay? So I really appreciate you guys and all you do. I hope that you are inspired to stay safe, to keep growing, keep learning. That's what AviatorCast is all about. If you do nothing else other than that, I would just be tickled pink, as you would probably hear your grandpa say. Tickled pink, that's neat. Anyway, really appreciate you guys being here. Keep it up. keep taking that next step. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Reach out, me@aviatorcast.com. For those of you that are live, I'm going to stick around for a few seconds after the broadcast is over. So I'm going to go through the closing sequence here and then answer some questions live on the air. So we will do that for a few moments. But that is it for now. Until next time, throttle on.